Do you remember when dinner brought everyone to the table? Not fast food, not drive-through. I'm talking about real meals. Meals that made your grandma smile and your dad ask for seconds. In this video, you're going to see 25 ground beef recipes that time forgot. These dishes are so good, they'll take you straight back to your childhood kitchen. Watch till the end, because the last one will blow your mind. Hobo dinner packets. Once upon a time, way back in the 1930s, times were tough and money was tight. But the kitchen was still the heart of every home. People didn't have much, but they had each other. And with a little creativity, they figured out how to turn a bit of ground beef into something comforting, filling, and even a little magical. They called it the Hobo dinner packet. It started with a simple patty of ground beef, seasoned with whatever you had. Chopped carrots, onions, and potatoes were piled on top. Nothing fancy, just straight from the garden or cellar. Then everything was wrapped tightly in foil and tossed onto hot coals or into a wood-burning oven. As it cooked, something wonderful happened. The veggies softened, their juices soaking deep into the meat, turning it tender and juicy. And here's a little trick many folks used. Just before sealing the foil, they'd sneak in a pat of butter and a pinch of dried thyme. As it melted, that butter turned into a golden sauce that made every bite rich and comforting. But what really made it special? Everyone got their own packet. No sharing, no slicing, just your own little dinner bundle, hot and steamy, made just for you. Kids would tear into them like presents, steam rushing out and that smell of beef and herbs wrapping around you like a warm hug. Sometimes families would add whatever scraps they could find, bits of bread, leftover cabbage, even a slice of apple for a touch of sweetness. And when the sun went down and the stars came out, the whole family would sit around the fire, each unwrapping their foil with hands warmed from the heat, hearts full from the moment. Even today, there's something timeless about it. It wasn't just a meal, it was a memory sealed in foil, a reminder that even in the hardest times, we can still create something warm, delicious, and made with love. Swedish potato beef casserole. Now picture this, a casserole so rich and comforting, it could make a little meat taste like a royal feast. That's exactly what Swedish potato beef casserole did, and it came straight from the old country kitchens of Minnesota. This dish started with thin, paper-like slices of potato, each one brushed with creamy white sauce. But not just any sauce. This one had a hint of nutmeg and white pepper, old Swedish secrets that crossed the ocean with immigrant families. They stacked the potatoes layer by layer, like a puzzle made of love. Then came the beef, tucked between those slices, waiting for the oven to do its work. As it baked, the juices soaked down and made everything melt together into something magical. When the casserole came out of the oven, the top was golden and crisp, while the inside stayed creamy and soft. It looked simple, but every bite told a story of cold winters, warm kitchens, and families sitting close at the table. Some folks say you could tell it was a real Swedish casserole by the way the potatoes were stacked, so neat it almost looked like artwork. It wasn't just food, it was tradition on a plate. Mothers and grandmothers would pass down this recipe not by writing it, but by showing. "Feel the sauce with your finger," they'd say. "You'll know it's ready when it clings like cream." It wasn't science, it was memory and instinct. And when it was served on a Sunday afternoon, usually in a glass dish that had seen decades of dinners, silence would fall over the table after the first bite. Not because there was nothing to say, but because it was just that good. Cincinnati-style chili mac. Let's take a trip to Ohio, where something wild happened to a regular bowl of chili. It got a makeover, and a delicious one at that. This dish is called Cincinnati chili mac, and it's a mix of Greek magic and American comfort food. It starts with spaghetti on the bottom, then comes that rich beef chili, but not your usual kind. This one has cinnamon, chocolate, and a secret spice mix that makes your taste buds dance. Then you pile on beans, onions, and a whole mountain of shredded cheese. It's sweet, savory, and spicy all at once. Greek restaurant owners came up with this twist long ago, and people couldn't get enough. Here's a fun secret. The original recipe had a splash of red wine vinegar. It made the flavors pop and sing like a choir. Every chili joint had its own version, and they guarded their spice blend like it was gold. People didn't just eat Cincinnati chili, they debated it. Do you want it 3-way, 4-way, or 5-way? Each version added more toppings, and everyone had their favorite combo. For many, it wasn't just food. It was Friday night dinner, football game fuel, or the taste of growing up. A messy, cheesy, delicious tradition. And if you were lucky, you got to eat it straight from a brown diner booth with a cold root beer and a paper napkin that barely stood a chance. It was part food, part ritual, and no matter how full you got, there was always room for one more bite. Some families made their own version at home, adding a dash of cinnamon, just like Uncle Nick did. And no matter how chaotic the kitchen, once that chili hit the noodles, all was right with the world again. Depression-era Meatloaf Wellington. During the Great Depression, money was tight and meat was precious. But that didn't stop clever home cooks from making something that looked like it belonged in a fancy restaurant. Enter the Depression-era Meatloaf Wellington, a creative twist on a luxury dish. Instead of expensive beef tenderloin, families used seasoned ground beef. They made their own dough using flour, water, and whatever fat they could find. Lard, bacon grease, or even butter if they were lucky. They'd roll it out thin, wrap it around the meat, and bake it until the outside turned golden brown. But this wasn't just about taste, it was about pride. Moms would score patterns on top of the dough, little wheat designs or crosshatches, turning simple meat into something special. It was a Sunday meal, a celebration, even if there wasn't much to go around. And when it came to the table, hot and steaming, it looked like a feast fit for kings, even if it started with scraps. The crust was crispy, the meat juicy, and the whole thing just felt like a big "we made it" moment. Some folks even wrapped coins in wax paper and hid them in the loaf for good luck. Whoever found one would make a wish before taking their next bite. It turned dinner into something exciting, a little game tucked inside every slice. Kids didn't know they were eating struggle food. All they saw was a golden loaf that smelled like love and looked like something out of a fairy tale. That's the power of a good recipe, taking what you have and turning it into something unforgettable. Ground beef radio dinner. Back in the 1930s, families didn't eat in front of the TV. They gathered around the radio, listening to comedies, mysteries, and music while something tasty bubbled away in the kitchen. That's how the ground beef radio dinner was born. It was one pan cooking at its best. You'd brown the beef just as your favorite show came on. Add in chopped veggies when the host told his first joke. Stir everything together as the story reached its big moment. By the time the episode ended, dinner was ready. The recipe was simple. Ground beef, onions, potatoes, maybe a handful of peas or corn if the garden had them. It all came together in one trusty skillet, timed to the rhythm of the radio. Each night had its own flavor. Mondays might taste like garlic and tomatoes. Fridays, a little Worcestershire and pepper. The ingredients didn't matter as much as the moment. Everyone sitting together, plates in hand, listening and laughing. Kids would race to set the table before the opening theme song, while moms stirred and dads adjusted the radio dial just right. You didn't need a dining room or even chairs, just the warmth of the stove and the sound of Jack Benny cracking a joke. And when dinner hit the plates, it wasn't just food. It was the final act in a shared performance, the kind that made even the smallest meals feel like a weekly tradition worth savoring. Beef and cornmeal tamale pie. Down in the Southwest, a new kind of casserole was bubbling up. Beef and cornmeal tamale pie. It brought Mexican flavor and American creativity together in one amazing dish. The magic started with the crust. But this wasn't just cornmeal dumped in a bowl. No, these home cooks toasted it first, stirring it in a hot skillet until the whole kitchen smelled like roasted corn. Then they mixed it with hot water to make a dough, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside. Inside that crust, Spiced ground beef with garlic, chilies, cumin, and whatever veggies the backyard garden could offer. Carrots, beans, corn, it was all fair game. Stretch the beef, feed more mouths, waste nothing. And here's the secret. They'd pour a little cream or butter over the top before baking. That helped it turn golden and added a rich, soft layer that soaked into the meat like a warm blanket. You could hear the pie crackle as it came out of the oven, golden and piping hot. The smell alone was enough to pull everyone to the table, even the neighbors if the windows were open. For families stretched thin, this dish meant more than dinner. It meant pride, culture, and a moment where everyone felt full, not just in their stomachs, but in their hearts. Sunday night hash soufflé. After a big Sunday dinner, there were always leftovers, roast beef, potatoes, maybe a bit of gravy. But clever cooks didn't let any of that go to waste. They turned it into something brand new and fancy-sounding, the Sunday night hash soufflé. They'd grind up the leftover roast beef, mash in yesterday's potatoes, and mix it all with eggs and a little milk. But here's where it got clever. They separated the eggs and whipped the whites until fluffy. Then they folded those clouds into the meat mixture. Into the oven it went, and out came something light, golden and puffy, like a meaty cloud. It looked so special, no one guessed it was just leftovers. Every family had their own way of making it. Some used special bowls passed down for generations. Others swore by stirring the eggs exactly 100 times. Whatever the trick, the result was always the same: an empty dish and smiling faces. Some even dressed it up with a bit of parsley or a ribbon of cheese on top, making it look like it came from a fancy hotel kitchen, not a small-town stove. It was Sunday night magic, turning scraps into something grand and proving once again that in the right hands, nothing in the kitchen ever really went to waste. Pioneer Trail Mix Meatballs. Out on the wagon trails, where space was tight and food had to last, pioneer women came up with something genius: trail mix meatballs. They weren't just tasty, they were built for survival. Ground beef was mixed with dried fruit, apples, raisins, even berries. The fruit helped keep the meat moist during long cooks over open fires. Then they rolled the meatballs in crushed dried corn for a crispy outer shell. They cooked them in heavy cast-iron pots right on the coals. That heat sealed in flavor and made sure the meatballs stayed good for days. And the best part? They saved the cooking liquid, let it cool into a jelly, and used it to preserve the extras for the next day's travel. Each family had their own version. Some added dried herbs from home. Others mixed in spices traded at stops along the trail. These meatballs weren't just food, they were little bites of hope, packed with flavor and strength for the journey ahead. And when the wagons circled for the night, those meatballs brought comfort after a long day of dust and distance. Families would sit close to the fire, plates in hand, listening to stories while savoring a taste that reminded them of the home they left behind, or the one they hoped to build. Kids would sneak the leftovers for breakfast, and sometimes even travelers from other wagons would ask for the recipe. It was more than a meal. It was a piece of survival, tradition, and love rolled into every bite. Victory Garden Beef Pie. During World War II, families fought their own battles at home against hunger and waste. That's when the Victory Garden Beef Pie came to life, right from backyard gardens. People grew everything they could: peas, carrots, potatoes, and mixed those veggies with a bit of precious ground beef. It all went into a pie dish with a crust made from mashed turnips or parsnips instead of flour. They saved the wheat for the soldiers. What made this pie amazing was how every neighbor helped. One family grew tomatoes, another grew beans, and they shared their harvests so everyone could eat. It wasn't just about dinner, it was about community. When it baked, the smell filled the house, and sometimes the whole block. Hot, savory, and made with love, this pie didn't just feed bellies, it fed hope. Kids helped too, digging rows, pulling weeds, and carrying baskets to the kitchen. They knew every carrot they picked brought them closer to supper. It was a small job, but it made them feel like heroes in their own right. On chilly nights, families would gather around the table, steam rising from each slice of that beef pie. With every bite, they reminded themselves they were strong, united, and doing their part to keep the country going. Railway station beef turnovers. Back when trains were the main way to travel, station kitchens cooked up something special for passengers rushing to catch their ride. Railway station beef turnovers. These handheld pies were more than just snacks. They were lifesavers for hungry travelers. The dough was folded over ground beef mixed with tiny chopped potatoes and onions. Cooks seasoned it just right, then folded the butter into the dough over a dozen times. That made the crust so flaky it would shatter with each bite, but strong enough to survive a trip. Station cooks became masters of timing. They'd see a train's smoke in the distance and get the turnovers piping hot just in time. Wrapped in wax paper, they warmed cold hands and filled empty stomachs on chilly platforms. Every train stop had its own secret twist. Some added sage, others paprika or garlic. The taste changed from town to town, but every bite felt like home. These little pies weren't just travel food, they were comfort, wrapped in dough, passed from one tired hand to another with a nod and a smile. Kids would press their noses to the glass, watching the cooks line the turnovers up in rows. Travelers would trade bites in the dining car, comparing flavors from different stations. And some folks bought an extra one, just to tuck away for the road ahead. Even after the train pulled away, the warm, buttery smell of those beef turnovers lingered in the air. It was the kind of meal that stayed with you, not just in your stomach, but in your memory. Depression stretcher patties. During the hardest times, families had to make food go further than ever. That's where depression stretcher patties came in. Ground beef mixed with rice, veggies, and a little bit of everything just to stretch it out. The trick was genius. 1 part beef, 2 parts cooked rice, a splash of milk, and anything else on hand. Onions, carrots, even leftover gravy. They'd shape the patties thin, fry them up, and get the edges crispy and golden. Those crispy edges were the best part. Some kids would eat around the middle just to get more crunch. Others would try to steal extra straight from the pan. These patties weren't fancy, but they filled you up and left nobody hungry. Even better, they made you proud. Proud that nothing went to waste. Proud that dinner still showed up, even when the pantry looked bare. Sometimes folks would whisper little tricks. Add a spoon of bacon grease for flavor, or grate in a potato to make it stretch further. Families handed those secrets down like treasure maps, and somehow every batch tasted just a little different from the last. And somehow, they always tasted better the next day. Wrapped in wax paper, warmed on the stove, maybe slapped between 2 slices of bread, they turned into next-day lunches that reminded you of home with every bite. Lunch counter beef scramble. In shiny diners along America's highways, cooks had a special dance behind the counter. Their secret weapon? The lunch counter beef scramble, quick, hot, and full of flavor. They'd drop ground beef onto a sizzling griddle, break it up with metal spatulas, and move fast, never letting it sit too long. That quick motion made the beef get little crispy bits that were packed with flavor. Next came onions, maybe some tomato sauce, and whatever secret spice blend the diner had stored in an old coffee can. Each cook had their own code. Paint it red meant tomato. Make it cry meant pile on the onions. Give it a blanket, melted cheese. Customers watched it all happen like a show. You'd sit on a stool, place your order, and watch your lunch get flipped, sizzled, and served in minutes. And it wasn't just about the food, it was the chatter, the clang of dishes, the smell of coffee in the air. It was knowing the cook's name and having them remember yours. The usual? They'd ask. That's when you knew you were a regular. It wasn't fancy, but it was fast, hot, and satisfying. The kind of meal that stuck with you long after you paid your nickel and walked out the door. And sometimes, if you were lucky, they'd scrape the last bits off the griddle and give them to you straight, crispy, salty, and unforgettable. Church supper, beef squares. In small towns across America, Sunday didn't end after church. It continued downstairs in the fellowship hall, where the smell of church supper beef squares floated up through the floorboards. These weren't just casseroles, they were square slices of heaven. Women in aprons pressed seasoned ground beef into giant pans, topped it with cheese, and poured on a secret sauce passed down from Grandma. Then they scored the top into perfect little squares, each one exactly the same size. To make sure no one got more than their fair share, they'd mark the spots with toothpicks like flags. It wasn't just food, it was fairness, fellowship, and flavor all in one. And just when the preacher gave his final amen, those beef squares hit their prime. The smell wafted upstairs at just the right time, like a sign from above that it was time to eat. People would peek into the kitchen early, guessing who brought what. "That smells like Mrs. Miller's with the celery salt," someone would whisper. And the lineup? It wrapped around tables, filled with chatter and belly laughter, as the beef squares disappeared one by one. For kids, it was the one Sunday meal where you didn't have to wait to be served. You grabbed your square, slid into a folding chair next to your cousins, and felt like part of something big and warm and welcoming. Factory workers' beef roll. In the noisy factories where America's machines kept turning, workers needed something strong, simple, and satisfying. Enter the factory workers' beef roll, a meal wrapped up and ready for the grind. This roll wasn't dainty. It was tough, built to last through long shifts and short lunch breaks. The dough was enriched with eggs and milk to keep it soft, even after sitting in a metal lunch pail for hours. Inside, ground beef mixed with chopped veggies and rice, all rolled up like a jelly roll. Some clever cooks would sneak in a surprise, a strip of cheese, a dash of pickle juice, or a swirl of ketchup that melted into the meat. They baked it low and slow until the outside formed a crust that locked everything in. Workers could slice off a piece, eat with one hand, and get back to their machines with full bellies. It wasn't just lunch. It was care, packed tight and baked with love by someone waiting at home. Mothers would stand at the kitchen counter at 4 a.m., rolling the dough in silence, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of their rolling pins. It wasn't just food prep, it was an act of devotion for the people they loved. And when the lunch whistle blew and those factory doors swung open, you could see the workers' faces light up. One bite of that warm beef roll reminded them of what mattered most: home, family, and the strength that got them through the day. Boarding house special. In crowded city boarding houses, cooks had to feed a dozen hungry workers with just a handful of ingredients. So they got smart, really smart. And that's how the boarding house special came to be. Ground beef was stretched with day-old bread soaked in milk. But here's the twist. They added a spoonful of leftover breakfast coffee. That bitter edge cut through the richness and gave the meat a deep, bold flavor. They layered it in a pan, potatoes on the bottom, beef in the middle, and a gravy made from whatever veggies they had on hand. Carrots, peas, even chopped up cabbage. It all worked. Every house had its own spice blend, kept in a tin above the stove and handed down like a family heirloom. New cooks learned the recipe like it was a secret code. This dish fed 20 people and made them feel like royalty. Not because it was fancy, but because it was made with love, skill, and a dash of magic only old kitchens could cook up. And oh, the way the smell filled the halls. One sniff of that bubbling dish meant dinner was near, and men and women would hurry in from the streets, coats still dusted with city grit, to grab a plate before it was gone. The boarding house wasn't just shelter. It was a second chance, a warm place to land. And the boarding house special? That was the taste of comfort, hope, and community, all in one steaming scoop. Beef and beans school lunch. Back in the 1950s, cafeteria ladies were the queens of the kitchen. With huge pots and bigger hearts, they whipped up meals like the beef and beans school lunch, a dish that fed a whole army of hungry kids. The secret? Navy beans soaked overnight and simmered until soft, then mixed with seasoned ground beef. But here's the clever twist. Those ladies would splash in some pickle juice from the giant jars they kept for sandwiches. It added just the right tang. They didn't use measuring cups. Their spices came from old coffee cans and pickle jars. A scoop of salt here, a shake of pepper there. But somehow, it was always perfect. Each bite was warm, filling, and just a little bit zippy. And it stuck with you, long after recess and even after graduation. Kids lined up tray in hand, and you could smell the beef and beans from across the playground. It wasn't just lunch. It was a memory in a bowl. And there was always that one lunch lady who knew your name, who gave you an extra scoop when you needed it most, without saying a word. Those bowls weren't just full of food, they were full of care. Years later, grown-ups would still talk about those lunches, not because they were fancy, but because they made you feel safe, full, and just a little bit loved in a world that was still big and new. Harvest time, hot dish. Out on the farms, when the crops were ready and the work was non-stop, farm wives knew just what to make. The harvest time hot dish. It was hearty, hot, and used whatever the garden gave that week. They started with their own ground beef, seasoned just right. Then came the layers, potatoes on the bottom to soak up the flavor, then beef, then corn, green beans, and tomatoes. But the secret? A layer of cream-style corn right in the middle. That turned into a rich sauce that pulled everything together. Each farmhouse had its own spin. In Minnesota, they added wild rice. In Iowa, it was sweet corn all the way. Whatever was freshest, that's what made it in. This dish didn't just feed people, it showed off the farm's best. When neighbors came over to help with harvest, this was what greeted them at the table. And after a long day in the fields, one bite of that creamy, hearty, hot dish felt like the biggest thank you in the world. Corner store curry beef. In busy American cities, little corner stores weren't just for bread and milk. They were hidden treasure chests of flavor. That's where corner store curry beef was born, a delicious mix of old traditions and new ingredients. Families who ran these shops came from places like India and Pakistan. They brought their cooking secrets with them, blends of spices like turmeric, cumin, and coriander. Instead of lamb or goat, they used what was available in their new home, ground beef. They'd sauté onions and garlic, stir in their special spice blend, and let the beef simmer until the whole store smelled like magic. It was warm, rich, and just a little spicy, perfect with rice or wrapped in warm bread. But the real beauty? They didn't keep the recipe to themselves. They'd measure out the spices into tiny paper bags, write instructions by hand, and hand them to customers with a nod and a smile. It wasn't just selling food, it was sharing a piece of home. Some shopkeepers even made custom mixes. A little milder for Mrs. Johnson, or extra cardamom for the Patel kids. Over time, the dish became more than just dinner. It became a bridge between cultures, one spoonful at a time. It wasn't just curry, it was connection. And for many families, it turned a small neighborhood store into the heart of their home-cooked meals. Mining town meat pockets. Deep underground, where miners worked long, dark hours, lunch had to be tough, just like the workers. That's where mining town meat pockets came in. These weren't delicate pastries, they were sturdy, filling, and made to last. Wives of miners got clever. They wrapped seasoned ground beef in thick rye-based dough, strong enough to survive being tossed in a lunch pail and carried into the mines. The crust kept the meal safe, and the inside stayed hot for hours. But here's the brilliant part. Every culture made it their own. Polish families added sauerkraut. Welsh cooks tucked in turnips. Italian miners spiced it up with peppers and oregano. The flavors told stories of where each family came from. One key detail, that thick, crimped edge. It wasn't just for looks. Miners would hold the edge with their coal-covered hands, eat the clean part, and toss the dirty edge away. These meat pockets weren't just practical, they were personal. Everyone packed with love, history, and the strength to get through another day. Prairie schoolteachers' casserole. Out on the lonely prairies, School teachers often lived in tiny cabins near one-room schoolhouses. Far from their families, they relied on the kindness of neighbors, and that's how the Prairie school teacher's casserole came to be. Each family would send a little something with their kids, some ground beef, a few potatoes, maybe a carrot or two. The teacher would mix it all together in a big baking dish, creating a meal to feed her students and herself during the noon break. She'd top it with crushed crackers and cornmeal for a crunchy golden crust. Baked in a wood stove, it came out warm and bubbly, smelling like comfort and care. In fall, the casserole might include fresh corn and tomatoes. In winter, root veggies took over. Whatever the season, it was always made with what was on hand and what was given with love. Some teachers became so famous for their casseroles, families copied the recipes into cookbooks alongside spelling lists and multiplication tables. It was more than food, it was community in a pan. And mealtime wasn't just a break, it was a moment of joy in a hard day. Kids would sit on the floor or benches, holding tin plates, while their teacher dished out scoops of casserole, laughing and sharing stories as the snow fell outside. Long after the school bell rang, those simple casseroles lived on in memory, warm, generous, and made from the kind of care that could only be found on the wide-open prairie. Beef and biscuit boarding house stack. Back in booming cities, boarding houses fed crowds of workers fast. That's where the beef and biscuit boarding house stack earned its fame, a clever, layered dish built like a skyscraper of comfort food. Cooks rolled biscuit dough paper thin, stacking it with layers of ground beef cooked with onions and a dash of leftover morning coffee. The coffee gave the meat a rich, deep flavor that no one could quite place, but everyone loved. Between every biscuit layer, they'd ladle in gravy, letting it soak down into the soft dough. The bottom turned almost pudding-like, while the top stayed crisp enough to crack with a fork. Stacks could go 6, 7, even 8 layers high. Hungry workers lined up early just to get a slice while it was still steaming. These stacks weren't just fast and filling, they were legendary. So much so that some workers would pay extra just to stay in a boarding house known for its beef and biscuit stack. The cooks became local legends, with their biscuit recipes kept in notebooks bound by string and oil stains. If you were lucky, you might get a second helping, or better yet, a corner piece where the edges had crisped up like pie crust. And when payday came around, the smell of the stack drifting through the halls was the reward everyone looked forward to. It wasn't just dinner, it was home, layered one biscuit at a time. General Store beef supper. In small-town America, the general store was more than just a place to buy flour and soap. On Saturday nights, it became the heart of the town, and that's when General Store beef supper was served. The store owner would mix ground beef from nearby farms with old stock rice, and here's the twist. He'd chop up leftover pickled vegetables from the jar and stir them right in. The tangy juice worked its way into the meat, giving it a kick that no one could quite figure out. Everything went into huge clay crocks to marinate while customers shopped. The potbelly stove warmed the mixture slowly, letting all the flavors blend together. By closing time, the whole store smelled like something amazing was about to happen. When families started gathering in the back room, that beef supper was ready, hot, hearty, and unforgettable. No fancy pans, no written recipe, just tradition passed from one storekeeper to the next, making Saturday night something to look forward to all week. Old-timers would pull up wooden chairs, playing cards while waiting for their portion. Kids snuck tastes with wooden spoons, and stories flowed just as freely as the food. It wasn't just a meal, it was an event. By the time lanterns were lit and plates were scraped clean, folks left the store not only full, but wrapped in a feeling of togetherness you couldn't find on any shelf. Farmhands' favorite. Before dawn even broke, farm wives were already in the kitchen, cooking something to fuel a full day's work. That dish was the farmhand's favorite, a rich, rib-sticking mix of ground beef and bread soaked in cream. They'd crack fresh eggs into the bowl, beat them fluffy, and fold them into the beef so it puffed up as it cooked. Some pressed it into heavy cast-iron skillets and slow-cooked it on the back of the wood stove. Others gave it a quick sear and finished it in the oven. But every farm had one thing in common: the final step, basting the top with a mix of butter and strong black coffee. That gave the dish a crust that sealed in all the juicy goodness and filled the kitchen with a smell so comforting it could stop chores in their tracks. It wasn't just breakfast or dinner, it was both. It was strength on a plate, built to power long hours in the fields, and when it hit the table, silence, then a chorus of forks and satisfied sighs. Sunday social beef squares. After church came food, and not just any food, Sunday social beef squares. These weren't just casseroles. They were edible art made by women who took pride in every slice. They'd press seasoned beef into square pans, score the tops into diamonds, and let the savory juices pool in each little cut. Some topped them with cheese, others with a secret sauce made from the coffee percolator in the church kitchen. But the real showstopper was the way they were served, laid out in rows on long tables, alternating with pickled vegetables, each square exactly the same size. Not a bite more, not a bite less. Ladies whispered tips: how to dice the onions just right, when to stir, how long to bake. Young brides watched and learned, knowing this was more than cooking, it was tradition. And just before the meal was served, the aroma would fill the whole church hall, so rich and inviting that even the kids stopped running around. It was like a signal that the feast was ready, and something special was about to begin. Some say you could tell who made which dish just by the pattern on top. Maybe it was crisscrossed for the Smith family, or little hearts for the Johnsons. Those beef squares were more than a meal. They were a message. You belong here, you're fed, and you're loved. Victory Kitchen, surprise. When World War II stretched the pantry thin, American kitchens answered with creativity. That's how Victory Kitchen Surprise was born, a dish built from what was on hand, but made to taste like a celebration. Instead of breadcrumbs, they used oatmeal, soaked in tomato juice from the garden. When garlic was hard to find, they used wild ramps. If onions ran out, they saved and minced the skins. Even celery leaves got dried and ground into seasoning. Every bite had a backstory. Every substitution was a small act of brilliance. And somehow, those kitchen surprises turned into something families kept making long after the war ended. The saying was, use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. But these cooks didn't just make do. They made dishes that tasted like resilience, courage, and love. And you know what? The best surprise wasn't what was in the dish. It was how good it made you feel. A hot meal shared with family, reminding everyone that even in the toughest times, home still had heart, hope, and something warm on the table. These recipes aren't just about ground beef. They're about American creativity, grit, and love. From church basements to factory floors, each dish tells the story of how families turned the simplest ingredients into something unforgettable. And here's the best part. With a few modern tweaks, these meals aren't just part of the past. They're perfect for today's families, too. Every time you bring one of these lost recipes back to your table, you're doing more than cooking. You're keeping history alive. So, which one will you revive in your kitchen? Will it be the Prairie schoolteacher's casserole, the mining town meat pocket, or maybe that Sunday social beef square? If this journey through America's kitchen history warmed your heart or sparked a memory, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Share your own family recipes, because every dish we remember is a story we save. And don't stop here. Watch the next video for even more memories of forgotten flavors, childhood, and timeless dishes that deserve a second life.